change your heart, change your life, change the planet.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Van Orden, and today I'm going to answer some of your comments. I've picked 3 that I think are related to each other, so I'm going to read them out, paraphrase them, and then answer them when I'm done reading. Okay, so someone asked, how do you turn off the ruminations and become productive? Someone else asked if I could shed some light on a routine to move from a depressive episode to running, exercising, and thinking right again. And someone else talked about my small steps being helpful, but it looks like they're struggling to build new habits. They want to develop a meditation habit to calm their anxiety in the moment because they get really hot-tempered and it's affecting their relationships. Okay, so ruminations, building a meditation habit or some other kind of habit, and moving beyond a depressive episode into the realm of right thinking. All right, first question, how do you stop ruminations? You don't. There are different parts of the brain that do different things, and there's several regions that come together to create what they call the default mode network. And that's your rumination engine that's feeding you that narrative stream that never shuts up. You don't stop it because the you that wants to stop it has no control over it. So one of the things that I do when I help people understand this process is to teach them the physiology of the brain in a very kind of lay way. Meaning you don't need to know the particular details of each brain region, but you need to know that there are different parts that do different things, and you have conscious control over very few of them. And the default mode network is one of the places that you don't control. So a lot of people who are starting meditation think that the goal is to stop the monkey mind, to stop the incessant voice, but it's not. The goal ultimately is to be okay with that part of the brain doing what it does and not to be triggered by it, but more importantly, not to identify with it, not to attach your identity to what it's saying, and then take your conscious cognitive resources and apply them to the narrative that's being delivered to you. It's going on and on about what somebody did, and finally you're like, yeah, you're right, they did do that, and I'm going to do this, and now you're hooked. So the ruminative engine just kept chirping away, and that's fine. But the moment you consciously identify with it and start embedding yourself into the story, that's where you get into trouble. So it's not about turning the ruminations off. It's about allowing ruminations to simply be what they are. Ruminations. One network in the brain doing what it does and doing it very well. And just like you can have a radio or television on in a room and you can leave the room, you can pay attention to something else. It's still playing. You didn't turn it off. But it doesn't have to become your moment. It doesn't have to become your narrative. Ruminations are simply suggestions. Your brain is trying to teach you something. It's trying to get you to think about something that's important. Generally, ruminations occur when there's been some kind of social faux pas, when there's some kind of challenge going on outside of you, in the world, in your family, at your job, in a relationship, etc. Or something you might have done on social media. So it is there to monitor your missteps and then to help you look at them to the point where you can come up with a new course of action. So they're really a teaching tool, but they often go to excess. So, and the reason they do that, okay, this is important. The default mode network comes on when you're inactive. When you're engaged in something, it largely shuts off. They call it the default mode because most people sit around most of the time, at least in the Western world. We're largely sedentary, so because our bodies are not occupied, our brain says, oh, we must have some time to process now. So let's go over and process these missteps, these mistakes, and learn from them. This seems like a good time. My body is not active, so I must be safe and out of the way of doing something that's going to get me hurt. So best way to move into a different part of the brain is to simply move. So you're not going to turn the ruminations off, but they'll gradually just fade into the background, and then they'll just lose blood. That network won't be getting blood. So I guess in a way you are turning them off, but not by trying to hit a switch. You're simply moving into a different part of the brain. So it's a positive choice rather than a negative choice. Positive choice, I'm going to do something that's going to shift me. Negative choice, I'm going to turn that damn thing off. Next question. Could I shed some light on a routine for moving from a depressive episode to running, exercising, and thinking right again? Well, if you look at my Start Here and Getting Started playlists, I have hundreds of videos in there that go over tools that I use on a regular basis to get me moving in the midst of depression. Depression is a response to injury, whether that be an injury to your identity, an injury to your body, an injury to your dreams. It's a repeated hitting or an absolute defeat with a single blow to some aspect of your being. But usually it's your identity that takes the biggest beating when it comes to depression. And a lot of the work that I do is about stepping outside of the identity. Now, what do I mean by that? Your identity is largely monitored and driven by a few different regions in the brain, but we have other regions in the brain that don't really have much, if anything at all, to do with identity. And we can function and take steps in those regions that are outside of identity. It doesn't mean they're superior, it doesn't mean they're better. They're just different parts of the brain that do different things, and we can function there. So a lot of what I do is first to recognize, okay, my identity is injured. My feelings are hurt. That's really what an identity injury is. Somehow I was thwarted, or my expectations were disappointed, or I was actually injured or attacked or rejected. Those are all injuries to one's identity, but often physically, you're perfectly fine. So the first thing I do is check in. Where is the injury? What's happening here? Is it an injury to my physical being or to my identity? 99 times out of 100, it's to my identity. And if that is the case, I tune in with my body, which is fine. And I tune into my environment, which is usually also fine. Not always, but usually. And then I start mindfully moving through the physical world that I'm in the body that I'm in, outside of the narrative of this identity and its injury and its future worthlessness. There need not be a future if I'm right here in the room and I'm engaging with this body in this room, in this moment. I don't need to have a future. I don't need to have a past. I don't need to have a rank in a social hierarchy. So what I do when that narrative comes on after some kind of social defeat, I simply say, oh, I get it. My identity was hurt. I'm now going to step outside of that identity into my body, into the world, into the part of me that can label things, that can describe things, that can associate and process things in interesting ways. And I'm going to spend some time there, and I'm going to give myself a project. That project might be getting dressed for running. That project might be getting out some notes to work on for the book that I'm engaged in. It could be all manner of things, but by engaging in that process and stepping outside of the story of my demise, I get to see that in the real world, my body has lots of options and lots of possibilities, and it's safe. So let's spend time there. Let's spend time in this body, in this environment, in this moment, and build a sense of efficacy. Build a sense that regardless of what's going on in the social world, I have the ability to do things. So I'm not incompetent, I'm not hopeless, I'm not useless or worthless. I can function, and I can function powerfully. And I do that every day. It's very effective. Okay, so finally, building a meditation habit to calm your anxiety. So my answers to the first two questions also apply here. I know a lot of people use meditation as a way to calm their anxiety, but when you use it that way, you're doing so from inside your identity. I am an identity trying to calm myself down. And while that can be somewhat effective, you're still acting as your identity. You're still acting in that realm. There's so much more power by simply observing. So when you step outside of identity, you get to observe, like, what am I feeling? What are the thoughts that keep playing? What is driving this anxiety? Rather than trying to calm the body down, just recognize that, oh, there's this story of doom playing in my head. I'm totally uncertain about my future. Well, what about the present? Can I find some certainty in the present? Can I tune in right here while that story of anxiety is playing? Because that's one part of me doing its job. But there are other parts of me that are currently unemployed, so let's employ them. So we tune into the being right here outside of that anxiety, next to that anxiety. Doesn't mean the anxiety has to go away. In fact, what you learn about, I don't want to say elite meditators, but people that have meditated for a really long time, their goal is not to quiet the mind. Their goal is to quiet their judgment about whether or not the mind is quiet. The goal is to be okay with whatever the mind is doing, because the mind is going to do whatever the mind does, because you don't have conscious control over it. So a huge lesson for me is what I call allowing. Just allowing the anxiety to be there and being okay with it. Kind of like a parent in a grocery store. There'll be a child screaming and throwing a tantrum, and the parent will often pick them up, put them on the shoulder, pat them on the back. Kid's still screaming, kid's still kicking and punching and whatever, and the parent just calmly walks them through the store, takes them for a walk. Eventually the kid calms down. Now, the parent didn't get into the story, didn't get into the screaming. They simply picked them up, made them feel safe. In some way, some part of them felt safe and taken care of, even if the child's narrative or identity did not feel safe, their body was safe. And eventually that permeates into the rest of them. So you can take these feelings for a walk. You don't need to get rid of them. Just allow them to be there, observe them, step outside of them, and realize that your brain is made of many different parts. And just because one part is screaming at you or telling you one thing doesn't mean that the rest of your brain has to listen. You can say, look at that. There's a part of me that's throwing a temper tantrum. Isn't that interesting? You don't need to calm down. You can just watch. Get some popcorn, put your feet up, and watch the temper tantrum in your head. Okay? I hope those answers are suitable. I know my take on this is a little different than most. I've studied way too much neuroscience to see myself or anyone as a single entity anymore. We've just got lots of different parts. And we recognize that from the neck down. We recognize that livers and spleens and kidneys and hearts and lungs do different things, but it's hard for us to understand that we have very different organs in our head as well. And that you can hang out in one of them while the rest of them are doing what they do, and you can be perfectly okay there. All right. If you have any more questions, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll try to answer those in an upcoming video. Okay. See ya.